Hey, good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Adam. How you doing, my friend?
Pretty good. Excited to talk about data today,
I know it's like I always say in our messages, talk data to me.
right?
Um, yeah, and it's such a huge topic and so many different ways to go about it. Looking forward to starting that discussion. It's going to be good. Uh,
So, I guess let's give our audience a little snippet about why they should care that we're talking about data. I guess I'll kick us
yeah,
off. So, my name is Adam Jennison, and I have spent most of my career doing product management work in data-driven products, a lot of AI, ML products. Um, as well as my individual contributor career, I came up kind of on the back end data engineering side of things. So, I've put in my 24-hour shifts making sure ETL failures are recovered from, and so I've been in the weeds with the data too.
yeah. I'm Dan Smith. Spent a good part of my professional career in product management, in some form or capacity. Uh, Mix of startups from ed tech to crypto, and data analytics and data viz, and enterprise in a product management role and in a sort of a capability service owner perspective. And so been one of the people who've had to be a user and consumer from the business end of data and sort of build out some sort of data capabilities. So has greatly influenced my view of data and how it looks in any kind of organization, any kind of scale. So yeah, it's just one of those fundamental things in the year 2021 that it's hard for me to even separate out product and service from data in this day and age. So yeah,
I
looking
agree.
forward.
One of the things that we've mentioned just kind of casually chatting about the subject is, big data is dead, right?
Yeah, yeah,
There's there's no
yep,
magical line threshold that you cross where suddenly your data is powerful. Like
right,
the just the environment that business operates in today.
yep,
All of that information, there's so much digital information being produced that, to your point, it's table stakes for organizations these days to be trying to leverage it in some way. And I would say that even I'll throw out a statement, and I'm interested how you respond. I would say it's even more than table stakes, that we're talking. You are putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage by not actively addressing data in your organization.
yeah, 100%. Like I said, there is no such thing as big data anymore. It's just data. And when you think about data on these sources, you know, if you're not looking to leverage your data or you're not actively trying to understand how to build your data pipelines or operationalize data, from the time it's created as a byte somewhere to the time it hopefully supports a decision, you're kind of handicapping yourself and you're forfeiting your right to compete, as I kind of call it, in 2021 certainly, and we're knocking on the door of 2022. So I 100% agree. You just how you think about data and what that means. And I know we have talked before about how to kind of break it down into different sort of segments. We're just using data as a catch-all right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're not actively managing that kind of data governance, data operationalizing operations, you're kind of just hoping the market will be kind to you because somebody else is going to, and somebody
Right,
else is.
exactly, because somebody else is going to. So let's pull on that thread a little bit. We're talking about using data in your organization. Uh, so what does that mean to you? What does using data in your organization look like?
Yeah, I mean, the way I've always kind of looked at and approached it, and from my experience, I think there's, I fundamentally think data is, again, I've said this before, data and design are always in support of decisions. And it's really, that's how I sort of got involved. I really started looking at how we make decisions, like decision science, with more rigor, and always anchoring to that kind of notion as speed is a superpower. But how do we make better decisions? And so I think we look at data, right? There's everyone knows about the four V's of volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. But there's also you could probably even been up to depending on how you want to come at it, this notion of how accessible is your data, how usable is the data, how valid is that data? Like those kind of three pillars, right, that we've talked about. Is kind of a good starting point. And so when you operationalize and try to make it in support of an org, I kind of anchor to the decisions. Who are the decision makers? How we make these decisions? What does that rigor look like? And of course that opens up a whole different avenue of discussion. But we've talked before about data as a service, data as a product, and there's data in support of services and products. And there's a lot of overlap, but there's some very I think some pretty key differences as well. Some of the practices might be the same, but how you approach it. What are your thinking?
No, I agree. And I think that I'm glad that you touched on, usability, accessibility, validity, and, the four V's of data, because I completely agree that the foundational or that base value add of data in the organization, whether you're applying it into data-driven product decisions or whether you're applying it in data as a service type products or data-driven machine learning AI type products, it's all about making better decisions based on objective information. But that's where it gets tricky, right? Because the worst thing you can do is actually not ignoring information and making data, just kind of off intuition and gut feeling. The worst thing you can do is have a bad data pipeline or have an unhealthy data environment in your company and be building decision-making processes on top of it so that you're incredibly confident in the bad decisions that you're making. It's to me, it's so much more dangerous to be operating in an environment where you think that the data is telling you something that it's not actually telling you because you haven't done the foundational work as an enterprise, as an organization, to establish those basic criteria of usability, accessibility, and validity in your data.
Yeah. And there's so many ways that it can go wrong, it feels like. The tools have become so much better and so advanced. But if you're not very mindful of the process itself at these different stages, you could have data drift, you could have issues with validity. And when you think about that kind of end-to-end process of getting data to, decision at some level and some variety, right? Just generically decision. Are you asking good questions of the data? Because that's going to drive how, quote unquote, the back end starts to curate and clean. And somebody has to manage that. Someone has to be mindful of that. Is this still the right data? Are we asking the right questions? And I would be remiss if I didn't sort of at least put a pin for a later conversation about the need for good documentation, right? Talk about usability and creating speed in the org for data literacy. Good documentation, metadata, all these kind of governance issues start to manifest when you anchor to this notion of decisions and decision making for whatever the use might be. So it's really tricky. It's very easy to go off the rails. And like you said, the super boogeyman out there is making high confidence decisions with bad data.
Right, exactly.
Because everything you're looking at, it's the iceberg, right? Everything says we're fine and we're making good choices. But because of not being mindful of that kind of end-to-end view, you got bad data. It's sort of a weak foundation.
Yeah.
And it's tough.
So I know yeah, absolutely. And I know we've been kind of painting a not quite a bleak picture, but highlighting the troubles that you can run into for our audience. But I'll share a story about, because I think you raised a really good point about that documentation and making sure that you have a well understood data dictionary, as well as well understood processes for managing, that you're actively combating data drift. But it reminds me of when I was working in the healthcare tech sector. And a big push in healthcare tech, it has been for a long time, but especially in recent years, there has been an understanding in that industry that a big roadblock to truly getting patients engaged in their health and truly getting patients to own their health record is the lack of an environment that's conducive to that kind of data sharing. And it's foundational. There's a lot of things that go into it, and obviously there's been some efforts to try and address it with standard data sharing protocols like HL7 and now FHIR, trying to break it down and make it a bit more granular. But at the end of the day, there's still those root questions to ask of your data that, hey, does this piece of digital information actually represent the business concept that I think it represents? And so one of the biggest problems that I ran into when I was taking two medical record systems and trying to merge them together, after I had been with a company that had merged with one of our competitors. And we couldn't, between the two systems, we couldn't even agree on a standard definition of what a visit was. I mean, that is a basic foundational concept, right? For the healthcare operations, and the systems modeled it completely differently. And so you couldn't say that, hey, if we were going to transfer, we wanted to migrate data from one system to the other, we couldn't just say, hey, we're going to pull this patient encounter over, because that patient encounter had, fundamental differences in how it was defined from a patient encounter in this system over here. And that, that can't be solved just technically. Like, sure. Could we go through a mapping? Could we figure out a way to make these bits of information, fit into this data model over here? Absolutely. But you lose the integrity of decision making because you've now diluted the concept. It doesn't mean the same thing. So you have a physical data model where it looks like it's the same thing, but that when you go to make decisions based off of that, it's invalid. You're not representing what you think you're representing.
And to put 100%, in another context, had a somewhat similar issue where we were building a machine learning product or service for internal purposes. I can't go into too much detail. And the algorithm wasn't the problem. It was like the noise of the ingested data and going through that, which of course reflects process. And that's I think we talk about words like data governance, data agility. I think one of the really powerful things is when you start asking these questions and you start to bring in kind of the architecture side, if you will, the business decision-making side, it starts to reflect back to you where you have huge opportunities for leverage to gain, right, for your org. Because data doesn't tell the whole story necessarily, but it doesn't lie. Like it may say, like, we always, like, to your great example, I'll dumb it down for myself. What is a visit? Like, these are just some non-obvious questions that people have to start thinking about sometimes when you start thinking through, what are we trying to answer? What are we trying to find out? What are the business goals? Then you start what you have here as far as the domain of data and how we'd actually instrument some of these things. Like, asking those questions, those should be, I think, where companies or startups or organizations look as like huge opportunities to improve your entire flow of decision making. Because like those pain points, when they're non-obvious questions start facing teams, and you start to work those problems and you start to document them and you start to share those things as they're in progress, those are huge opportunities for gain, I believe, for the similar point. Maybe we'll start talking about these notions of speed to insight and speed to action, right? These kind of ephemeral metrics that people can customize to see what makes sense for them. But 100%.
So,
like I said, the other example we had, like I said, we experienced a lot of this. Like, the algorithm works, but to your point, that wasn't the issue. It was the data and not knowing what was there, and having two different data sources, at least two, that would ostensibly say the same thing, but when you double click on it, very different pieces of data, right? Very different information underlying that. So I agree. One of the questions I thought it'd be interesting, I'd love to have your thoughts and your feedback, is just kind of briefly talking about this idea of usability. Like, what's it mean when we're building these things? It could be, with your experience working and building data itself as the product, right? Or as the service, rather than in support of some other decision we're trying to make, right? Mm-hmm. Where have you seen some things where people get tripped up, where you see opportunities? Like, what's that look like?
So when I'm thinking about data usability, it's really, especially in data as a product, it's really kind of two use cases. There's data usability in terms of, and not to go too far down a nerdy rabbit hole, although this is a data podcast, so maybe that's appropriate. But there's that statistical aspect of it, and by that I mean just pure statistical validity. That, hey, I want to use this data. If I am, and this really applies a lot to what you were just kind of talking about with the algorithm side of things. If I want to leverage this data and feed it into an algorithm, there are certain standards of cleanliness that data has to have in order for that algorithm to produce meaningful results, right? And so to me, that's one data usability consideration. But then there is and this almost ventures into that accessibility realm, but there's, if you want your data to be democratized, let's call it, if you want your organization to be marching towards data agility, right? Where and by that I'll simply mean, to your original point when we were talking about the intro, the ability to speed up that decision making process. That speed is a superpower. If that's your target, if that's where you want to take your organization, then data usability, I would argue, is not a technical problem. Data usability is a business problem, because it starts to address, address some of those points that we had raised as being issues. What is a visit? When I look at this piece of information and I double click on it and I double click on this information over there, is it really the same thing? And so that has to be actively managed. I mean, data drift, and just to put a definition of that out there, data drift being exactly that scenario where you have this piece of information over here, and then for whatever reason, somebody at some point decides that same bit of information needs to exist over here as well. But then each of those sources takes on a life of its own and starts growing in different directions. Data drift.
Yeah.
If you aren't actively managing that as an organization, if you don't have a program in place to manage that as an organization, it's going to ravage you. I mean, there's and you can't retrofit it, right? I mean, that's one of the I think that's actually one of the biggest hurdles for an organization, like a big legacy organization who really wants to start to leverage this kind of data, is it's really hard to go back and rewind that stuff in legacy systems. Like, walking data drift back that's a painful, if not nearly impossible, problem to solve.
Yeah. Yeah, you can have a team of people like that. That's their career. That's all they're gonna do, which is probably not much fun. No, I totally agree.
So following that thread, if I'm a CEO, and let's just for argument's sake say I'm a CEO, entrepreneur, we're a startup, we want to be leveraging data, we want to be making good decisions, maybe we want to be building AI driven products. What's your advice? Where do I start? So we've talked about all these pitfalls. How do I avoid them?
Yeah, I think one of the answers, right, where you just said is the first thing is embracing data, not trying to say how we if you're not retrofitting, it's a lot easier, right? So when I was doing a crypto startup, it was just a given. like we're based on data. Like everything we did was data driven. So it's built in. And what I'm kind of anchored to, I want to come back to one thing real quick is this issue of usability, and we might do another discussion on this, is that notion of data literacy, right? And this kind of system feedback loop of literacy, making your data better and better and making those decisions better. It's like a virtuous cycle. But if you're starting off as data as a product or a service, let me first share my thoughts on data in support of a product or service. It's a subtle distinction sometimes, but I think one of the things to start looking at is look at the practices we do now, right? Whatever it is we do, whatever it is we build. I think one, committing to using data to at least inform decision making. And then when you're going through your processes, right, you could do other tools like impact mapping, service blueprints. Start thinking about in a more meaningful way how we're going to actually make decisions. And I won't go into a double click on this right now, but I think a powerful concept is, what's our null state? What does the world look like today, right? Because now you can form good, and we'll, again, this is topic for another discussion, but we started talking about testing and hypotheses. Like if you have this notion of what the world looks like today, and we are committed to making data informed at least decisions, you can start building into all your analysis. How will we know, right? Asking that question, either if you have the metric beforehand, or how will we know? And I'm thinking in my mind right now, kind of your standard service blueprint, right? I think it's not enough in this day and age. I'm just using this example. And I'd love to have your thoughts on this, Adam. I think in 2021, it's, in my opinion, it's time to advance some of these notions. It's not just a back-end process, right? It has to be more purposeful. I think it has to be highlighted. It's more surgical. And because it's more meaningful, you have the ability to capture data. You have the ability to measure things, being careful, what you measure. So I think a lot of it's just building in, analytics and data from the ground up in the processes you already engaged in to make decisions, right? And that's going to reflect back where you probably have some gaps and you've made some pretty big assumptions. Because we're, historically, product, I think, professionals, we're getting better as I would say actually quite advanced in documenting assumptions and hypothesis testing and framing these things. But the tools we use, I think we could be more purposeful in putting data analytics in the forefront. Now, if I'm talking about machine learning in a large org, you have probably more experience in that than I do. I have some other background experience in that. I know the pain points I dealt with there were, one, really being super, super mindful and purposeful of the business driver, and then also making sure you have the data architecture there in a collaboration. I think anytime you can lower or eliminate the walls between those, you're so much better off than handing things off. And the last thing I'll just throw out there is, I think we have I think there's kind of a garden variety notion of what a product team looks like right now. I personally believe there's probably room to start thinking very purposefully about putting the data person, that role, on the team. I think that is, personally, I think that's probably approaching kind of table stakes again, back to that notion. What's the fundamental thing we need to do to advance our product and services in a meaningful way that achieves our organizational results? Data is there. Like, there's no way around it. And so it's such a robust issue. I think it deserves kind of being elevated more purposefully.
I 100% agree, and I really like what you said about bringing the data decision making and that intentionality around what we want to capture. And really, it's more of that intentionality about what questions do we anticipate asking of this data in the future. Right. And you have to have that up front. You have to be considering that up front. That's a pitfall that I stumbled into a couple of times as a young product manager, coming up in the data world, where I'd be working with the product teams, the delivery teams, building out various products, whether they were driven by data or producing data. I spent a lot of time working on system of records, so we produced a lot of data for enterprises. And there would be times where we'd lay out a feature, we'd lay out our service blueprint, we'd lay out our story map. It was great. We were aligned on the solution. Everything got built. And then 3 months later, I'd come back and say, oh hey, I'm in pursuit of improving this product. I'm really interested. I need to know, is this happening? To go back to anchor to healthcare tech again. I spent about a decade in that world, but looking at some of the insurance claims processing, and that's a very data heavy process. That's all EDI and X12, and so very structured, very standardized, and so because it's all structured and standardized, I'm like, oh good, someone's handled the cleanliness and the validity for me. I don't have to worry about it. It turns out that, hey, if I want to know how many times this claim has been reprocessed, rebuild, and I want to be able to trace that thread and answer questions about, hey, this was originally submitted for $300,000, and then it got denied, and then reprocessed for an additional 30% of that, and then this whole cycle. It's like, oops, I didn't tell them we needed to track the history, so we have none of that change data recorded in the log. And so it seems like that's like, oh, that's a basic thing. Like, hey, we should be able to ask any question we want of our data. But to your point, as you're laying out that service blueprint, as you're laying out that story map, if you're not looking at, okay, and how am I going to measure this? How do I know, as I'm laying out the outcomes that I want to achieve with this product, I should also be saying, okay, and how am I going to know that I got there? Because if my engineering teams aren't thinking about tracking that up front, those products may not be instrumented. We may not be capturing the right data. We may not be capturing the data in the right way. I mean, that's the other thing is, all right, let's say all the data is captured. Maybe it was captured in an unstructured format that, once again, creates a scenario where we'd have to go back and unwind, decisions that have been made and try and parse out data that it may or may not be valid, looking back at it and parsing it out that way. Whereas if we had just said up front, oh, hey, no, we need granular visibility into this versus this versus this, then, that to your point, the confluence of the architecture and the business thinking around it, your the difference between your logical data model and your physical data model, reduce that drift by asking those questions up front. And so I think that's a really powerful point is, hey, you got to be actively thinking about these things, and you have to be anticipating where you want to go with this in the future.
I think on that, be curious your experience in this. I think a lot of times the sort of legacy default is asking the question, do we have the data? Or you map these things out and you just kind of trust that an architect or engineer is going to find the data without regard to, again, the usability, the validity. And lots of times, depending especially if you're doing the kind of a bigger, more expansive project, maybe you have longer timelines, it might be one of the last things you find out. And if it's one of the last things you find out, there's an issue with bad data, everything else kind of feels like, what was the point? Because we're not really going to know, right? So if we've been that decision curve backing on itself, I don't care if it's a week, a month, or a year, you can mitigate that. Obviously, good agile practices, right? That's kind of why we're talking about some of this. You can mitigate some of that. You have this kind of issue of process validity decay, process decay. If you find out too late, you find out you can't iterate fast enough. You can't actually know to make a good decision going forward. Because you haven't created the space and the intentionality behind having that data conversation, the insights conversation, if you will. And bringing like those two ends together to make a much, much better decision framing. Because if, over time you start off, you're going to have a lot of pain points. To your point, if you have like data drift, someone's got to be watching and managing that. Like someone has to do that.
Dan, that's such another great point that you bring up. The classic trope that is at least now widely regarded as a cardinal sin in product development is you don't go build a solution and then try and find a problem for it, right? I'd say that a parallel here is you don't find a business problem and then or target a business problem and then try and find data to support it. If you
Yeah.
really want to be a data driven organization, if you really want to have that data agility, be building out these frameworks to have that speed and reliability, decisiveness in decision
Right.
making. It's once again, it's that you got to move that intentionality up front. You have to look at the data that you have in your organization. You have to understand what your data is and what your data can tell you, and then
Right.
you can conceive of products, solutions. I mean, maybe it's just some analytics or metrics that you want to produce to help
Yeah.
drive decision making in your organization. But you got to start with what you have. You got to start with what you have, and you got to start with what you have that's valid and reliable and
Yeah.
accessible.
Yeah.
And you build from there. I agree with you that organizations get themselves in trouble when they find out way too late that
Yeah.
there's and it kind of ties into and this could be another rabbit hole for a conversation in the future, but it kind of ties into, hey, a lot of business people think of machine learning and AI as kind of a magic bullet, right? Like we can go, we're like, oh, we have this complicated business problem. We have this complicated logistics problem. We want to, we have
Yeah.
a logistics optimization problem, and so, I'm going to assume that I can throw an AI algorithm at this, and it's going to be able to
Right.
optimize my freight and transit costs. But
Right.
if you haven't put the right infrastructure in place, if you
Yeah.
haven't, have the right programs, the right architecture around making that data available, once again, you're either not going to
Yeah.
be able to answer that question, and you're not going to find out until you've spent 6 months, developing the solution, developing the shell, getting the dashboards out there. And this ties back into the data literacy, because if your engineering team isn't necessarily fluent in what that
Yeah.
data means from a business perspective, oftentimes these are the kinds of problems that, oh, hey, wait a minute, that algorithm is producing results that don't actually mean anything, or that's outside the constraints of what's really possible in a business. Like,
Right.
sure, to go back to that kind of logistics reference, it's top of mind. I'm working with a client on it right now. We're uh, we're looking at a logistics problem that doesn't have it's the algorithm is recommending solutions that would violate supplier contracts.
Yeah.
And that's another, like, hey, we don't have those contractual constraints built into our structured data environment, so we can't apply them to the algorithm.
Yeah.
But that's not something that an engineer is necessarily going to recognize as they're going through the development process.
Yeah.
Without that shared data literacy of both on the business side, what can my data do, and on the engineering side, what does my data mean? So you don't find out for
Yeah.
6, worst case scenario, 8 months after you've built
Right.
the algorithm, you've built the dashboards, you've built the shell, you get it in front of the business users, they're all excited to use it, and then they're like, hey, I can't actually do any of these
Right.
recommendations. And yeah, that's
It's
a
that last
terrible
mile
waste of
problem.
money.
Yeah, it's that last mile problem, and had a somewhat similar situation in a previous context where, again, the algorithm was not the issue. It worked. We overcame some, I would say data validity issues, but from the business perspective, from the end-to-end process perspective, I would say there wasn't really a way to scale the algorithm into that last mile of what it needed to do. Like the algorithm worked, it did what it needed to, but there was this process, this handoff where, again, thinking about in support of these business decisions, this last mile was not ready, prepared for that. So it just kind of got stalled. It can happen like in ways that if almost like if you haven't been through it, it's hard to see it coming, and it's not always obvious that it's going to happen. But back to to your point, I think where you can kind of build in some of these safeguards, not safeguards, but ways to mitigate. is being mindful of, what does your governance look like around this? Not just governance for the data itself and who's responsible for good, clean data, but governance on how we make decisions, right? What does this look like? How's data going to flow through? And you just mentioned something before. I think it's I personally was quite powerful. Is this notion of it's kind of a substrate of usability. It's reproducibility, right? You want data to be reusable and reproducible by people for their needs. That gives you scale, and that really I kind of refer to kind of deep speed, because it's not obvious, right? We can put things on calendars and say we're going to make a decision by this date and so forth, but the ability to make for distributed independent teams to use data as they kind of need to, and that the team, I could be a person on that team without having to do a bunch of custom things per se, or to have the ability to update your data model as necessary. That's just incredibly powerful. Like, that is an amazing ability to build for your organization if you can get there. Like I said, you can't get there without like being purposeful and intentional. Like, this is where we want to go as an organization.
Yeah, I think reusability is a good word because we'd like to view, and at least I view, data as foundational to the organization, right?
Yep.
It's a base layer, and it's not. And I want to make it clear, it's a base layer for the organization, not
Right.
not IT,
Yep.
not development, not the data department,
Right.
not BI and analytics. It's a base layer for the whole organization.
Yeah. Who owns the data? The company
Right.
owns the data.
Right. Finance consumes it.
Yep.
Ops should consume it. You should be trying to develop products off of it. You might want to be, creating a suite of analytics and, kind of business intelligence insights out of it. But it's a foundational layer to the company. And in order for it to be an effective foundational layer for the company, you can't be producing one-off ad hoc data solutions and data sources for every specific use case. You really have to target that reusability. You want the same data, and it's a multi-fold benefit where, one, you're saving the time, you're saving the effort by not having to produce these one-off data solutions, but also you're maintaining that consistency and that validity of insights by applying that same base, that same foundation, that same data source, that same data concept constructed in the same way. For any of my statisticians out there in the audience, that's the holy grail, right? We want our data to be very, very precise, very clean, very reusable, because that increases or I should say that decreases the variance between the different insights that we're going to get. Even if you're able to maintain a consistent logical definition of what a visit is, if you're operating out of two different data sources, inevitably there's going to be some variance. There's going to be some degrees of divergence between those two sources. It's just the nature of the beast. And so I really think that that concept of intentionality, that concept of moving data considerations as far left as we can in that process, and as far down into that base layer of the organization as we possibly can, is really, that's the cornerstone of being truly a data agile organization and having that deep speed, as you said.
I agree 100%, my friend. 100%. And there's so many topics we could go deep on, and I expect we will. I have all kinds of great ideas in my head about when you're starting out this journey, right? Like, one of the things to look for is the data dungeon master, these one-offs, right? That's always a big red flag when there's somebody has this database over here or warehouse that they only know how to kind of access, and they know what's in there. That's one of the things right away, red flag. And then you when you start talking about reproducibility, this issue of 50 local maximums, right? That does not necessarily equal a global maximum. It's just the variance and how that scales is non-linear, I think, when you have all the other issues of data decay and data drift, people kind of tweaking, customizing over here. And the thing that, the boogeyman in my head is this notion of customer. Like, how do we know the customer, right? We're going to have different needs, right? People are going to have different needs, but these things can be managed. You can get to a stable state of trying to articulate what does it mean to have a customer identification? Like, what does the customer profile look like? The holy grail of the customer 360. It may mean different things for different parts of the organization that you're in. But again, if you're intentional and you're trying to manage, these layers of stable states where you know and have these definitions, you understand that we're focused on like quality, cleanliness, timeliness, kind of like mitigating all those 4 V's, right? The usability and what the usability means to each person in that value chain internally to your org has to be sort of managed purposely and understanding it. And I don't know of any other better way to get there than, again, creating that space for the data conversation or the insights conversation, depending on how fancy you want to get, where, again, it's no longer like data is part of the back end process on that service blueprint model, right? It's like front and center. Like, we don't make decisions or we don't think through this without understanding what are the questions we want to ask about behavior? What is it we want to know? Because I think having gone through that process on my own, the gaps start to become obvious or become apparent. Where do we need to have like deep dives on? What are the questions we need to follow up on? And again, borrowing like some of these agile tactics and methodologies, it's a lot easier to get there and answer those questions using that than it is like hoping that it turns out okay just before launch.
Yeah.
By the way, we actually don't know.
What is it Dennis always says? Hope is not a strategy.
Hope is not a strategy. That's right, my friend. Well, it's been a great conversation.
It has been a great conversation.
Looking forward to do it again. We do it all day.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I'm certain that we will do it again. There is I think a ripe tree of topics here for us to pluck fruit from.
100%.
And I hope that our audience gets some their appetite whet a little bit to see how data could help their organization and maybe some of the scary stuff that we can help them avoid. Thinking through things and being intentional about it. So I look forward to continuing to explore these conversations with you and get some good data advice out there for the people, because this is a near and dear to my heart. I'm very passionate about data, both from a statistician standpoint as well as that business owner standpoint of, hey, I truly believe it's the future, and the future is now. It's as much as we've seen kind of over the last 20 years that every company's a software company now. I think
like it or not,
a decade or so, every company's a data company.
Yeah, 100%. And I encourage folks to reach out if they have any questions or follow up various social media channels.